Mrs. White sat at her desk, her eyes scanning the neatly organized piles of papers awaiting her approval. It was an ordinary day at Oakwood Academy, a school known for its prestigious reputation and rigorous academic standards. Yet, as she reached for another report, something caught her eye. An envelope, plain and unmarked, nestled between the files. Frowning, she lifted it, feeling a strange chill creep down her spine. The principal wasn't a woman who enjoyed surprises, and anonymous notes often led to trouble. She hesitated, then tore the envelope open with deliberate care. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded with precision. The words scrawled on it were concise, written in neat, almost delicate handwriting. You need to check locker 172. Something dangerous is hidden there. For a moment, Mrs. White sat still, her mind racing. Locker 172 belonged to Ethan Barnes, a senior who had consistently been a quiet, top-performing student. She had barely noticed him over the years. He was the kind of student who slipped through the cracks because he never caused trouble. The notion that he might be involved in something dangerous felt absurd, but the note lingered in her hands, as if it demanded her attention. Her instincts told her to discard it, to ignore the baseless suspicion of whoever had sent the note. But something about its urgency gnawed at her. What if there was truth behind these words? Rising from her chair, Mrs. White tucked the note into her pocket and walked out of her office. The long, sterile hallways of the school were silent, save for the muffled sounds of a distant classroom. The school day was nearing its end, and she could already hear the rustle of students packing up for the day. She took steady, measured steps toward the row of lockers by the science wing, where locker 172 was situated. Ethan had never stood out to her before. He was polite, quiet, and kept to himself, traits that usually meant a student was focused and not problem. As she approached the locker, her heart beat a little faster. She felt foolish for even considering this, but the nagging feeling persisted. What if? Glancing around to make sure no one was watching, she inserted her master key into the lock and opened it. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing the inside. For a moment, Mrs. White saw nothing out of the ordinary, just textbooks, a neatly folded jacket, and a water bottle. But then, her eyes drifted to the back of the locker, where a stack of papers was wedged between two books. Carefully, she reached in and pulled them out. Her breath hitched as she unfolded the first sheet. The paper was covered in disturbing images, violent, chaotic drawings that depicted strange, dark figures, almost monstrous in appearance, surrounding what appeared to be a lone boy. As she sifted through the rest, the drawings grew darker, more unsettling, until she found a letter at the bottom of the stack. The handwriting was familiar, neat, delicate, just like the note that had been slipped under her office door. The words on the page were cryptic, filled with references to them and it, but it was clear that Ethan was in some sort of trouble. Her stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. Before she could process the full gravity of what she had uncovered, the final bell rang, jolting her from her thoughts. She shoved the drawings and let her back into the locker and slammed it shut, her mind spinning. She needed time to think, to figure out her next move. As students poured out of classrooms and into the hallways, Mrs. White stood rooted to the spot, staring at locker 172. The note had been right. Something dangerous was indeed hidden there. The next morning, Mrs. White couldn't shake the images she had seen. She arrived at the school earlier than usual, her mind still racing from the discovery of the previous day. Every time she closed her eyes, those dark, ominous drawings flashed behind her eyelids, and the cryptic words in Ethan's letter echoed in her thoughts. Who had written the note? And more importantly, why? As the first students began to trickle into the building, Mrs. White found herself hovering near Ethan's locker again, as if drawn to it by some invisible force. She was determined to confront him today, to get answers. But she needed to tread carefully. The last thing she wanted was to cause unnecessary alarm, especially with the school's reputation on the line. By the time first period began, Mrs. White was seated at her desk, staring blankly at her schedule for the day. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She looked up to see Mr. Harper, the school counselor, standing in the doorway. "Good morning, Mrs. White," he greeted with a smile. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course," she replied, though her mind was still elsewhere. Mr. Harper sat across from her, his expression more serious now. "I've been meaning to talk to you about one of our students, Ethan Barnes." Her heart skipped a beat at the mention of his name. "What about him?" she asked, doing her best to sound casual. "I've noticed some changes in his behavior over the past few weeks," Mr. Harper said, leaning forward slightly. "He's become more withdrawn, more anxious. He's always been quiet, but recently, it's been different." Mrs. White felt a chill run down her spine. Could Ethan's behavior be connected to the disturbing drawings and letter she had found? She nodded, keeping her composure. "I've noticed some things as well," she said carefully, "but I wasn't sure if it was worth raising any concerns yet." "I think it might be," Mr. Harper replied. "I've scheduled a meeting with him this afternoon. It might help to talk to him, see if there's anything bothering him." Mrs. White hesitated. Should she mention what she had found in his locker? Or should she wait until she had more information? "Let me know how it goes," she finally said, her voice steady. "I'd like to follow up afterward." Mr. Harper nodded and left the office, leaving Mrs. White alone with her thoughts once again. The tension was building, and she could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She knew she had to confront Ethan sooner rather than later, but the timing had to be right. That afternoon, as classes let out for the day, Mrs. White watched from her office window as Ethan walked out of the building, his head down, his movements sluggish. Something was definitely wrong, and she wasn't going to let go unnoticed any longer. Tomorrow, she would confront him directly. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. The next morning, Mrs. White stood at her office window, watching as students filed into the school building. Her eyes were fixed on Ethan, who, as always, moved quietly and deliberately, blending into the crowd of students without drawing attention to himself. He walked with his shoulders hunched, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his gaze focused on the ground. He seemed to shrink into himself, as if he were trying to disappear. Mrs. White's heart ached as she watched him. She couldn't help but think of the disturbing images she had found in his locker, the cryptic letter that hinted at something far more sinister than what appeared on the surface. Ethan was hiding something dangerous, and she needed to find out what it was. Her mind was made up. Today, she would confront him. As soon as the first bell rang, Mrs. White left her office and made her way to Ethan's first class. She waited outside the door, leaning against the wall, her arms crossed. The hallway was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of voices from nearby classrooms. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression calm, determined to handle this delicately. When Ethan finally appeared, Mrs. White straightened and stepped forward, blocking his path. He looked up in surprise, his expression guarded. "Ethan, I need to speak with you for a moment," she said, her voice gentle but firm. He hesitated, glancing around as if looking for an escape. I have class." "This won't take long," she assured him. "Come with me, please." Ethan swallowed hard, then nodded. He followed her down the hallway and into her office, his footsteps dragging slightly behind hers. Once inside, Mrs. White closed the door and gestured for him to sit. He did so reluctantly, his eyes downcast, avoiding her gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Mrs. White studied him, searching for any sign of what was troubling him. His body language was tense, his hands fidgeting in his lap. He was clearly uncomfortable, but there was something more, something deeper. "Ethan," Mrs. White began softly, "I've noticed some things lately that have me concerned. Your behavior has changed, and I'm worried about you." He shifted in his seat, still refusing to look at her. "I'm fine." "You're not," she replied gently. "I've seen the drawings in your locker. I've seen the letter." At this, Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "You what?" "I found them yesterday," Mrs. White continued, her tone calm and steady. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy, but after receiving an anonymous tip, I had to make sure there was nothing dangerous going on." Ethan's face went pale, and for a moment, Mrs. White thought he might be sick. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, He simply stared at her, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Ethan," she said softly, leaning forward, "I'm here to help. Whatever's going on, you don't have to go through it alone." For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't understand? Then help me understand," Mrs. White urged, her heart breaking at the sight of his distress. "I can't help you if you won't let me." Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the door as if he was considering making a run for it. But then he seemed to deflate, his shoulders slumping as he sank deeper into the chair. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling in his lap. "I can't talk about it," he whispered, his voice strained. "It's too dangerous." Mrs. White's stomach tightened. She could see the fear in his eyes, the weight of whatever secret he was carrying pressing down on him. He was terrified, and that made her even more determined to get to the bottom of this. "Ethan, whatever it is, I can help," she said, her voice firm. "But you need to trust me." He looked away, his jaw clenched. "I can't." Mrs. White felt a surge of frustration, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Ethan, if you don't talk to me, I'll have no choice but to take this to the authorities. I don't want to do that, but I can't ignore what I've found." At the mention of the authorities, Ethan's face went even paler, his eyes wide with fear. He shook his head violently, his voice panicked. "No, you can't. Please don't." "Then talk to me," Mrs. White pressed. "Tell me what's going on." For a moment, Ethan sat frozen, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he struggled to compose himself. Then, with a shaky breath, he muttered, "It's not what you think." "What do you mean?" Mrs. White asked, leaning closer. Ethan swallowed again, his voice barely above a whisper. "The drawings, they're just nightmares. I have these dreams, and I can't get them out of my head. I draw them because it's the only way to stop them." Mrs. White frowned. "Nightmares." Ethan nodded, his eyes still filled with fear. "But the letter? That's different. It's not about the dreams. It's about something real. Something that's happening." Mrs. White's heart pounded in her chest. "What's happening, Ethan?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the door again. I can't say." "You need to," Mrs. White urged. "If you're in danger, I need to know." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. "They'll hurt me if I say anything. They told me not to tell anyone." Mrs. White's blood ran cold. "Who, Ethan? Who's going to hurt you?" He shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. I can't tell you. Please, just leave it alone." But Mrs. White couldn't leave it alone. Whatever was happening to Ethan, it was far worse than she had imagined. Later that afternoon, Mrs. White sat in the school board's conference room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the table, the board members were speaking in hushed tones, casting glances in her direction. The tension in the room was palpable, and Mrs. White's heart raced as she waited for them to address her. Finally, Mr. Lewis, the chairman of the school board, cleared his throat and leaned forward, his expression stern. "Mrs. White, we've been made aware of your investigation into one of our students, Ethan Barnes." Mrs. White nodded, though her pulse quickened. She had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "Yes, I've been looking into some concerns regarding his well-being." Mr. Lewis's brow furrowed. "We've received word that you've been going through his personal belongings without his consent. Is that true?" Mrs. White hesitated. "I received an anonymous tip that something dangerous was hidden in his locker. I checked it to ensure the safety of the school." "And did you find anything dangerous?" Mr. Lewis asked, his tone sharp. "No," Mrs. White admitted, "but I did find some disturbing drawings and a letter that suggests Ethan might be in some kind of trouble." The board members exchanged glances, and Mrs. White felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She knew where this was going. "Mrs. White," Mr. Lewis said, his voice measured, "we understand your concern for the student, but we cannot have this kind of unauthorized investigation. The school's reputation is at stake, and we need to handle these matters through the proper channels." Mrs. White's frustration flared. "But this isn't just about the school's reputation. Ethan is clearly in distress, and I believe he's in danger. We can't ignore this." Mr. Lewis's expression hardened. "You need to be careful, Mrs. White. If you overstep, it could lead to serious consequences for both you and the school. We advise you to leave this matter to the appropriate authorities and focus on your duties as principal." Mrs. White clenched her fists beneath the table. She knew the board was more concerned with keeping the school's image untarnished than with Ethan's safety. But she couldn't let this go. "I understand your position," she said, her voice tight, "but I'm not willing to stand by and do nothing while a student is in danger." Mr. Lewis's gaze narrowed. "Then you leave us no choice. If you continue down this path, Mrs. White, we'll have to reevaluate your position at this school." Mrs. White felt a surge of anger and fear, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to back down, not when Ethan's safety was on the line. Mrs. White returned to her office after the tense meeting with the school board, her mind swirling with frustration and concern. The warnings from Mr. Lewis echoed in her head. She was risking her job, her career, by pursuing this. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't push Ethan's terrified face from her mind. The fear in his eyes when he had whispered, "They'll hurt me." The urgency in his voice when he begged her to leave it alone. But how could she leave it alone? Sitting at her desk, Mrs. White stared at her phone, the board's threat still fresh in her thoughts. She knew she needed allies, and one person came to mind, Mr. Harper, the school counselor. She had already spoken with him briefly, but now she needed his full support. If she was going to protect Ethan, she couldn't do it alone. She dialed his extension, her fingers tapping anxiously on the desk as she waited for him to pick up. After a few rings, his voice came through the receiver, warm and calm as ever. "Mr. Harper speaking." "Hi, it's Mrs. White," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was hoping you had a few minutes to talk. It's about Ethan Barnes." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Mr. Harper responded. "Of course. I can come to your office right now, if that works." "Perfect," Mrs. White replied, already feeling a slight sense of relief. "See you in a bit." 10 minutes later, Mr. Harper entered her office, his usual calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Mrs. White's tension. He sat across from her, folding his hands on his lap as he waited for her to speak. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. White began, her voice carrying the weight of the past few days. "I wanted to discuss Ethan in more detail. I've uncovered some things that concern me, and I need your perspective." Mr. Harper nodded, his eyes serious. "I've been worried about him as well. As I mentioned before, I've noticed changes in his behavior. Withdrawn, anxious, distracted. I've tried to reach out to him, but he's been closed off." Mrs. White exhaled, knowing she could trust him. "It's more than just anxiety. I've found disturbing drawings in his locker, along with a letter that suggests he's in some kind of danger." Mr. Harper raised an eyebrow. "Danger? What kind of danger?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," she replied, frustration leaking into her voice. "But when I confronted Ethan, he wouldn't tell me anything. He's terrified. He said that if he speaks out, they will hurt him." Mr. Harper leaned forward, concern deepening the lines on his face. "That's serious. We need to act carefully. If he's afraid of someone or a group hurting him, we can't force him to speak without protecting him first." Mrs. White nodded, relieved that he was taking this as seriously as she was. "The problem is, the school board is breathing down my neck. They've warned me to stop digging, to leave this to the authorities. But if I do that, I'm afraid Ethan will shut down completely or worse." Mr. Harper frowned, his mind clearly working through the situation. "We can't involve the authorities without evidence. If Ethan's scared and unwilling to talk, that's going to make things even harder." "I know," Mrs. White sighed. "That's why I need your help. He's supposed to have a meeting with you soon, right?" "Yes, I've scheduled a session with him later this afternoon," Mr. Harper confirmed. "I was going to approach it from a more general angle, see if he opens up about anything. But after what you've told me, I'll need to tread more carefully." Mrs. White's eyes narrowed as she thought aloud. What if you gained his trust first? He might be more willing to talk to you than he was with me. He sees you as someone he can confide in. Mr. Harper nodded slowly. "That could work, but I'll need to take it step by step. If he feels cornered or pressured, he might retreat even more." "Agreed," Mrs. White said. We'll have to be patient, but time isn't on our side. If something is truly threatening him, we don't know how long we have." Mr. Harper leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I'll do my best, but if Ethan's fear is as deep as it sounds, we're dealing with more than just a personal issue. This could be something much bigger." Mrs. White's got twisted at his words. She had known it in her heart since the moment she saw the drawings and read the letter. This was bigger than just a troubled student. Ethan was in serious danger, and the clock was ticking. That afternoon, as the last bell of the day rang, Mrs. White couldn't focus on anything but Ethan's meeting with Mr. Harper. She knew the counselor would approach him carefully, but she couldn't help feeling a gnawing anxiety. What if Ethan refused to speak again? What if he remained closed off, and they lost their chance to help him? Sitting in her office, she pulled up Ethan's student file on her computer, hoping to find any clues about his past that might explain his current behavior. His academic record was impeccable. Straight A's, perfect attendance, no disciplinary issues. He was the model student, the kind that flew under the radar because he never caused trouble. But as Mrs. White dug deeper, she noticed something strange. There was a gap in Ethan's school history, 1 year where he hadn't been enrolled at Oakwood Academy. It was the year his mother had passed away. She realized, a year marked by absence, not just from school, but from his life. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she pulled up his psychological evaluation from that year, conducted when he returned to the academy. The report was brief, but revealing. The psychologist had noted signs of grief, depression, and trauma, particularly related to his mother's sudden death. But there was something more, a note about Ethan's reluctance to speak about his father. Mrs. White's heart sank. She knew Ethan's father was distant, cold, even, from her brief interaction with him during her home visit. But was there more to it than she had realized? She printed the report and tucked it into a folder, determined to investigate further. As she left her office, her thoughts were interrupted by Mr. Harper's soft knock on the door. He stepped inside, his face unreadable. "How did it go?" Mrs. White asked, her stomach churning with anticipation. Mr. Harper sighed as he sat down across from her. "It was difficult. Ethan is still extremely guarded. He wouldn't open up much, but I did notice something concerning." Mrs. White's pulse quickened. "What was it?" "He mentioned his father," Mr. Harper said slowly, in passing, but it was enough to give me pause. "When I asked about his home life, he became visibly anxious. He wouldn't say much, but I got the feeling that his father is a source of fear for him." Mrs. White frowned, the pieces slowly coming together in her mind. "I suspected as much. I visited his home last week, and his father seemed cold, almost hostile." Mr. Harper nodded, his expression grim. "There's something there, Mrs. White. I can feel it. But Ethan won't talk about it directly. He's too scared." "Scared of his father?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harper hesitated, then nodded. "It's possible, but there might be more to it. I've seen this kind of fear before in other students. It's not just about one person. It's about control, isolation, manipulation. If his father is involved in something dangerous." Mrs. White's mind raced as she processed his words. The drawings, the letter, Ethan's silence. It all pointed to something far worse than she had imagined. And it was clear now that Ethan's father was at the center of it. She felt a surge of determination. Whatever was happening in Ethan's life, she wasn't going to let him face it alone. She had to act, and soon. Mrs. White couldn't shake the conversation with Mr. Harper. If Ethan's father was indeed at the center of his fear, there was no time to waste. The unease she felt after her brief visit to their home had lingered in her mind ever since. It had been a cold, tense interaction, and now she realized that her instincts had been right. The following morning, Mrs. White found herself sitting in her car just down the street from Ethan's house. The neighborhood was quiet, the early morning light casting long shadows across the modest homes. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she went over her plan. She wasn't entirely sure what she expected to find, but she knew she couldn't sit back any longer. If Ethan was in danger, she needed to confront it head-on. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and approached the Barnes residence. The house was small and unassuming, with a well-kept yard that contrasted with the sense of foreboding that lingered in the air. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for a response. After a few moments, the door swung open, and Mr. Barnes stood before her. His expression was as cold and distant as she remembered, his tall frame looming in the doorway. His eyes narrowed when he saw her, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "Principal White," he said, his voice flat. "What brings you here again?" Mrs. White straightened, meeting his gaze with as much authority as she could muster. "Good morning, Mr. Barnes. I want to follow up on my visit from last week. I've been concerned about Ethan, and I'd like to speak with you both about his well-being." Mr. Barnes' expression hardened. "There's nothing to discuss. Ethan is fine. I don't appreciate you showing up unannounced." His words were dismissive, but Mrs. White wasn't deterred. She could sense the tension in the air, the same tension she had felt during her last visit. Something wasn't right, and she wasn't about to walk away without answers. "I understand that you may feel this is intrusive," she began, choosing her words carefully, "but I've noticed some troubling signs in Ethan's behavior at school. As his principal, it's my responsibility to ensure that he is safe and supported." Mr. Barnes crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw tightening. "Ethan's behavior is none of your concern. He's my son, and I know what's best for him." Mrs. White's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not here to accuse anyone, Mr. Barnes. I'm here because I care about Ethan. He's clearly going through something difficult, and I believe it would be helpful for us to work together to support him." For a moment, Mr. Barnes didn't respond. His eyes bore into hers, cold and calculating. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. Mrs. White hesitated for a brief second before stepping inside. The house was neat and orderly, but there was a sterile quality to it, as if it were more of a museum than a home. The walls were bare, and the air felt heavy, as though the very atmosphere was stifling any warmth. Mr. Barnes led her into the living room, where Ethan sat on the couch, his body tense and his gaze fixed on the floor. He didn't look up when they entered, but Mrs. White could see the stiffness in his posture. The air between them felt charged with unspoken tension. "Ethan," Mrs. White said softly, moving closer to him. "How are you doing?" He didn't respond. His hands were clenched tightly in his lap, and his eyes remained glued to the floor. "Ethan," his father said sharply, his tone commanding. "Answer your principal." Ethan flinched at his father's words, and Mrs. White felt a surge of anger. She could see the fear in the boy's eyes, the way his entire body seemed to shrink in on itself whenever his father spoke. "I'm fine," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible. Mrs. White knelt in front of him, her heart aching at the sight of his fear. "Ethan, it's okay. You don't have to be afraid. I'm here to help." For a brief moment, their eyes met, and she saw a flicker of something, perhaps hope, or maybe desperation, but it was quickly snuffed out when Mr. Barnes cleared his throat behind her. Mrs. White stood up, turning to face him. "Mr. Barnes, I'm concerned about the pressure Ethan is under. I think it would be beneficial for him to speak with a counselor regularly, someone he can trust and open up to." Mr. Barnes' face darkened. "I don't think that's necessary. Ethan doesn't need a counselor. He needs discipline." Mrs. White's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Discipline is important, but so is emotional support. Ethan is clearly struggling, and I believe he would benefit from having someone to talk to outside of school." Mr. Barnes' eyes narrowed. "I've had enough of this. You've overstepped your boundaries, Mrs. White. This is my home, and I'll decide what's best for my son." Mrs. White took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew she was walking a fine line, but she couldn't let this go. "I understand your position, Mr. Barnes, but as a principal, it's my duty to look out for the well-being of all my students, including Ethan. If there's anything happening here that's putting him in danger, get out," Mr. Barnes snapped, his voice cold and unyielding. Mrs. White froze, shocked by the sudden outburst. She could feel Ethan's gaze burning into her, but she couldn't turn to face him. The tension in the room had become unbearable, and she knew that pressing any further would only make things worse. Without another word, Mrs. White nodded and made her way to the door, her heart heavy with frustration and worry. As she stepped outside, the weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. Ethan was clearly in trouble, and his father was a major part of it. As she walked back to her car, she glanced back at the house, her mind racing. She had hoped to get through to Ethan, but it was clear that he was too terrified to speak openly in front of his father. She would have to find another way, another opportunity to help him. But she wouldn't give up. Not now. The next day, Mrs. White sat at her desk, staring at the stack of papers she had been avoiding all morning. Her thoughts kept returning to Ethan, to the fear she had seen in his eyes during her visit. She knew he was in danger, but without concrete evidence, her hands were tied. She couldn't go to the authorities based on suspicion alone. As she tried to focus on her work, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was from a local journalist, someone she had spoken to a few times in passing, but never in the context of school matters. The message was short and to the point. "I heard you've been looking into Ethan Barnes. Care to comment?" Mrs. White's heart sank. She hadn't told anyone outside of the school about Ethan. So how had this information reached the press? Her mind raced as she considered the possibilities. Could someone from the school board have leaked the information? Or worse, could it have been someone within her own staff? The thought made her stomach churn. She had been careful not to involve too many people in her investigation, but it seemed that someone had betrayed her trust. She quickly typed a response. No comment. Where did you hear this? A few minutes later, the journalist replied, "Sources within the school." Seems like a big story. Mrs. White's blood ran cold. This was exactly what she had feared. The school's reputation was on the line, and now the media was circling like vultures, ready to pounce on any sign of scandal. If word got out about her investigation, it could ruin everything, not just for her, but for Ethan as well. She leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the betrayal settle over her. Someone had leaked the information, and now she was facing a dilemma she hadn't anticipated. If the story went public, it could force the school board's hand and potentially put Ethan in even more danger. But if she didn't act quickly, the situation could spiral out of control. As she sat there, trying to make sense of the situation, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Mr. Harper standing in the doorway, his expression troubled. "Mrs. White, I need to talk to you," he said, stepping inside. "Come in," she replied, trying to steady her voice. Mr. Harper closed the door behind him and sat down across from her, his face etched with concern. "I heard about the media inquiry. This could be bad, really bad." "I know," Mrs. White said, rubbing her temples. "I didn't want it to come to this. I don't know how they found out." Mr. Harper hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I think I know who leaked it." Mrs. White's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "One of the board members, Mr. Fletcher. He's been speaking to people outside of the school, hinting at an internal investigation. I didn't think much of it at first, but now..." Mrs. White felt a surge of anger. Mr. Fletcher had always been more concerned with the school's reputation than the students' well-being, but this, leaking sensitive information to the media, was beyond unacceptable. "What do we do now?" Mr. Harper asked, his voice tense. "If this gets out, Ethan could be in even more danger. And if the board finds out you've been speaking to the press, they could use it as grounds to remove you." Mrs. White clenched her fists. She had come too far to back down now, but the betrayal cut deep. Mr. Fletcher's actions had put everything at risk, not just her position, but Ethan's safety as well. "We need to contain this," she said, her voice firm. "I'll speak to the journalist and tell them there's no story here. But we can't let Mr. Fletcher get away with this. He needs to be held accountable." Mr. Harper nodded, though the worry in his eyes remained. "And what about Ethan? What if this escalates?" Mrs. White's heart ached at the thought. She had tried so hard to protect him, but now it seemed like the situation was spiraling out of control. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice heavy with frustration. "But we can't stop now. We'll find a way." As Mr. Harper left the office, Mrs. White sat back, her mind racing. The betrayal had shaken her, but it had also strengthened her resolve. She wouldn't let the setbacks stop her. Ethan needed her help, and she would find a way to protect him, no matter the cost. The next day, Mrs. White arrived at school with a sense of urgency. The revelation that Mr. Fletcher had leaked information to the press gnawed at her, but she couldn't afford to lose focus. She had managed to fend off the journalist for the time being, claiming that there was no story, but the threat still lingered in the back of her mind. However, her top priority remained the same, Ethan. She needed to get through to him, and today felt like her last chance. As she sat in her office, gathering her thoughts, a knock on the door made her look up. Mr. Harper entered, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his posture said enough. "I spoke with Ethan this morning," he began, his voice low. "He's finally agreed to talk to you." Mrs. White felt a surge of relief. She had been waiting for this moment, but at the same time, she knew she needed to handle it delicately. Ethan was fragile, and one wrong move could make him retreat again. "When?" she asked, her voice barely concealing her urgency. "After lunch," Mr. Harper replied. "He's nervous, but I told him you're here to help." Mrs. White nodded, trying to steady herself. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. I know how difficult this has been for him." Mr. Harper gave a small nod before leaving her office. Alone again, Mrs. White exhaled slowly, mentally preparing herself for the conversation ahead. Ethan had been through so much, and whatever he was about to reveal could very well change everything. The minutes ticked by slowly, but eventually it was time. Mrs. White stood and made her way to the counseling room, where Ethan was waiting. Her heart raced as she reached the door, but she took a deep breath, pushing down her anxiety. This wasn't about her, it was about Ethan. When she entered the room, Ethan was sitting at the far end of the table, his head down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. He looked smaller than usual, as if the weight of the world had pressed down on his shoulders. Mrs. White approached cautiously, taking a seat across from him. "Hi, Ethan," she said softly, trying to ease the tension. "I'm really glad you agreed to talk with me." Ethan didn't look up at first. His fingers continued to twist nervously in his lap, and Mrs. White could see the struggle in his expression. She waited, giving him space to gather his thoughts, not wanting to push him too hard. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan finally spoke, his voice so soft that Mrs. White had to lean forward to hear him. I don't know where to start," he murmured, his voice shaky. "That's okay," Mrs. White replied gently. "There's no rush. You can start wherever you feel comfortable." Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes still fixed on the table. "It's just, I'm scared. I don't want to get anyone in trouble." Mrs. White's heart clenched at the fear in his voice. She leaned in slightly, her tone reassuring. "Ethan, I promise you, whatever you say here stays between us. My only concern is making sure you're safe." For a moment, Ethan was silent. Then, with a deep breath, he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were filled with fear, but also a glimmer of something else, trust. I've been drawing those pictures because I don't know how else to deal with it," he said, his voice trembling. "The nightmares, they won't stop. Every night, I see them. Mrs. White asked softly, trying to encourage him to continue. Ethan nodded, his eyes haunted. "The people who come to the house. My dad lets them in, and they go into the basement. I'm not supposed to know, but sometimes I hear them talking. They say things, scary things." Mrs. White's breath caught in her throat. This was far worse than she had anticipated. She had suspected something was going on at home, but not this. She kept her expression calm, not wanting to alarm Ethan any more than he already was. "Do you know who these people are?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Ethan shook his head quickly. "No, I've never seen them up close. But I know they're doing something bad. I can feel it. And sometimes my dad gets angry." Ethan's voice cracked, and he looked down again as if ashamed. Mrs. White's stomach twisted. She had been right about Ethan's father, but now the pieces were falling into place. Whatever was happening in that house involved more than just a strict, cold father. There was something far more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. "Ethan," Mrs. White said gently. "Has your dad hurt you?" Ethan didn't respond right away. His hands trembled, and for a moment, Mrs. White thought he might not answer. But then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Tears stung Mrs. White's eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't lose her composure now, not when Ethan needed her most. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered, her voice full of empathy. "You don't deserve to go through this." Ethan's shoulders shook, and Mrs. White realized he was trying to hold back tears. She wanted nothing more than to reach across the table and hug him, to reassure him that he wasn't alone. But she knew that Ethan needed to feel safe, and right now, that meant giving him the space to speak. "What happens when these people come to your house?" Mrs. White asked softly, her heart pounding with dread. Ethan wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't know exactly. I'm not allowed to go down there. But one time, I saw my dad arguing with them. He looked scared. And after that, he was different, more angry, like he was losing control. Mrs. White's mind raced. Ethan's father was involved in something dangerous. And now that she had a clearer picture of what was happening, the urgency of the situation became painfully clear. "Ethan," she said gently, "I believe you, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're safe. But I need you to trust me. I'm going to have to involve other people to help you, okay?" Ethan tensed at the mention of others, but Mrs. White quickly added, "Not the police, not yet. Just people who can help. People like Mr. Harper. We're going to figure this out together." Ethan hesitated, but after a long pause, he nodded. "Okay." Relief flooded through Mrs. White, but it was tempered by the gravity of what lay ahead. She had finally broken through to Ethan, but now came the hardest part, protecting him from whatever dark secrets were hidden in that house. The following afternoon, Mrs. White paced in her office, her mind racing with the events of the previous day. Ethan's confession had left her shaken, and the danger he was in seemed more real than ever. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to confront Ethan's father, directly and decisively. It wasn't an easy decision. The school board had already warned her about overstepping her boundaries, and if word got out that she had gone to Ethan's home again, she could very well lose her job. But none of that mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was getting Ethan out of that house before something worse happened. Mrs. White called Mr. Harper into her office. She needed his support for what she was about to do, and she trusted him implicitly. When he arrived, his expression was serious, as if he could already sense what was coming. "We need to go to Ethan's house," Mrs. White said without preamble. "I've spoken to him, and I'm convinced that whatever is happening there is dangerous. We can't wait any longer." Mr. Harper's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't argue. "What did he say?" Mrs. White filled him in on Ethan's confession, the mysterious people coming to the house, the arguments, the fear in Ethan's voice when he spoke about his father. As she recounted the details, she could see the concern growing in Mr. Harper's expression. "We need to act carefully," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If we push too hard, Ethan's father could shut us out completely, or worse, retaliate against Ethan." "I know," Mrs. White replied, her stomach churning with anxiety. "But we can't wait for something to happen. We need to confront him and let him know we're watching." Mr. Harper nodded, his expression grim. "I'll come with you. We'll be stronger as a team." Together, they left the school and drove to Ethan's house. The tension between them was palpable, and Mrs. White could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had never felt more anxious about a confrontation in her life, but she knew it was necessary. Ethan's safety depended on it. When they arrived at the Barnes residence, the house seemed even more foreboding than before. The air was thick with tension, and the sight of the drawn curtains and darkened windows only added to the sense of unease. Mrs. White knocked on the door, her heart in her throat. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and Mr. Barnes stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold indifference. "Principal White," he said, his voice flat. "And Mr. Harper, to what do I owe this visit?" Mrs. White stepped forward, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "We need to talk about Ethan." Mr. Barnes' expression darkened, and for a moment, Mrs. White thought he might slam the door in their faces, but instead, he stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. They entered the house, the oppressive atmosphere closing in around them. Mr. Barnes led them into the living room, where Ethan sat on the couch, his body tense. His eyes flicked to Mrs. White and Mr. Harper, and for a brief second, she saw a flicker of hope in his expression. "We're here because we're concerned about Ethan," Mrs. White began, her voice calm but firm. "He's been struggling, and we believe that something happening here in this house is contributing to that." Mr. Barnes crossed his arms over his chest, his expression cold. "You're overstepping, Mrs. White. What happens in my house is none of your concern." Mrs. White met his gaze evenly. "When it affects one of my students, it is my concern." There was a tense silence as Mr. Barnes stared at her, his eyes hard. Then, in a low, dangerous voice, he said, "I suggest you leave now." Mrs. White's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "We're not going anywhere until we know that Ethan is safe." For a moment, Mr. Barnes didn't move. His eyes flicked to Ethan, who sat frozen on the couch, his face pale. Then, without warning, Mr. Barnes lunged forward, his hand grabbing Mrs. White's arm. "You don't know what you're talking about," he hissed, his grip tightening. Mr. Harper stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Let go of her." For a moment, it seemed as if Mr. Barnes would refuse, but then he released her, his face contorted with anger. "Get out of my house." Mrs. White's heart raced, but she remained calm. "This isn't over, Mr. Barnes. We're watching. If anything happens to Ethan, anything at all, you will be held accountable." With that, she and Mr. Harper turned and left the house, their hearts pounding. The confrontation had been more intense than either of them had anticipated, but they had made their point. Ethan wasn't alone anymore, and his father knew it. As they drove away, Mrs. White couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot, but at least now, Ethan knew they were on his side. The confrontation with Ethan's father had left Mrs. White rattled. She couldn't shake the image of Mr. Barnes' cold, calculating gaze as he had threatened them to leave. The tension between him and Ethan was undeniable, and Mrs. White knew that whatever danger Ethan faced wasn't going away. But she also knew that they had sent a message. Ethan was no longer invisible, and they wouldn't stop until he was safe. However, the situation at school wasn't any easier. Word of her continued investigation had reached the school board again, and it wasn't long before she received a summons to meet with them. As she sat in the familiar conference room, waiting for the meeting to begin, the weight of the upcoming conversation settled heavily on her shoulders. The door opened, and Mr. Lewis, the chairman of the board, walked in, followed by two other board members. Their expressions were stern, and Mrs. White could already feel the tension in the room building. "Mrs. White," Mr. Lewis began, taking his seat at the head of the table, "we've asked you here today to address some serious concerns regarding your recent actions." Mrs. White nodded, her face neutral, though her heart was racing. She knew exactly what they were about to say, and she was prepared. At least, she hoped she was. Mr. Lewis glanced at the other board members before continuing. "It has come to our attention that you have been continuing your investigation into Ethan Barnes' situation, despite our previous warnings." "Yes, I have," Mrs. White replied calmly. "Ethan is in danger, and I'm doing everything I can to ensure his safety." Mr. Lewis's expression darkened. "Mrs. White, we made it clear that your role as principal does not include investigating students' personal lives without proper cause or authority. You've overstepped your boundaries, and it's putting the school at risk." Mrs. White felt a surge of frustration, but kept her voice steady. "With all due respect, Mr. Lewis, this isn't just about the school's reputation. This is about a student's life. Ethan is living in a dangerous situation, and if I don't act, who will?" One of the other board members, Mrs. Callahan, shook her head. "We understand that you're concerned, but we can't afford to have the school's name dragged through the mud in the media. There are protocols in place for these kinds of situations. You should have handed this over to the authorities long ago." "The authorities don't have enough to act on," Mrs. White countered. "And Ethan is too scared to speak openly. If we force him into a formal investigation, it could push him further into isolation. We need to gain his trust not frighten him into silence. Mr. Lewis leaned forward, his voice cold. "You've put this school in a precarious position, Mrs. White. We've already had a media inquiry, and it's only a matter of time before this spirals out of control. You've been warned about the consequences of continuing down this path, and now we have no choice but to give you an ultimatum." Mrs. White's heart skipped a beat. She had known this was coming, but hearing it said aloud still sent a wave of dread through her. Mr. Lewis's gaze was unyielding. "Either you cease your involvement in this matter immediately and allow the proper channels to take over, or you'll be asked to step down from your position as principal." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Mrs. White felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she could speak. She had worked so hard to protect Ethan, to get him the help he needed, and now she was being asked to choose between her career and the safety of one of her students. But there was no real choice. She had made her decision long ago, the moment she opened Ethan's locker and saw those disturbing drawings. She couldn't turn her back on him now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. With a deep breath, Mrs. White met Mr. Lewis's gaze. "I won't stop," she said firmly. "Ethan needs someone to protect him, and if that means I have to step down, so be it." The room fell silent. The board members exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by her resolve. Mr. Lewis's face remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps respect or maybe frustration. "So be it," he repeated, his voice low. "We'll give you until the end of the week to hand in your resignation." Mrs. White nodded, her stomach churning, but her resolve unshaken. "I understand." The meeting ended, and Mrs. White walked out of the conference room, her head held high despite the turmoil inside her. She had known the cost of her actions, and now that cost had come due. But she wouldn't back down. Ethan was worth every sacrifice she had to make. The weight of the school board's decision hung over Mrs. White like a dark cloud, but she pushed it aside as she walked the familiar halls of Oakwood Academy. Her mind was focused on one thing: Ethan. She had lost her position, but she hadn't lost her determination to protect him. As she approached her office, she spotted Mr. Harper waiting for her. His face was drawn with concern, and she could tell that he already knew the outcome of her meeting with the board. "They asked you to step down, didn't they?" he asked, his voice low. Mrs. White nodded, her expression grim. "I have until the end of the week." Mr. Harper sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened." "It's not your fault," Mrs. White replied. "I knew what I was risking, and I'd make the same choice again." Mr. Harper looked at her, his eyes filled with empathy. "What now?" "We keep going," Mrs. White said, her voice firm. "We can't stop now. Not when we're so close. Ethan is counting on us." Mr. Harper nodded in agreement. "I spoke with him earlier. He's been more withdrawn than usual, but I think he's starting to trust us." "Good," Mrs. White said. "We need to keep that trust. I'll visit him after school today, see if I can get him to open up more." As the day dragged on, Mrs. White's mind kept returning to Ethan. She knew the pressure he was under, living in fear of his father and the unknown dangers in his own home. The weight of those fears had to be unbearable for a boy his age, and she worried that he might not be able to hold up much longer. When the final bell rang, Mrs. White grabbed her coat and headed for her car. She was determined to speak with Ethan again, to let him know that she wasn't going anywhere, even if the school board had forced her out. But as she pulled up to his house, something felt wrong. The curtains were drawn, and the house looked eerily still. Mrs. White stepped out of the car, her stomach knotting with unease. She approached the front door and knocked, but there was no response. She knocked again, harder this time, but still nothing. Her heart raced as she circled around the side of the house, her eyes scanning the windows for any sign of movement. When she reached the back, she noticed that the door to the basement was slightly ajar. Her breath caught in her throat. She remembered Ethan's mention of the basement, how he wasn't allowed to go down there, how that was where his father's visitors went. Without thinking, Mrs. White pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cold and musty, and the dim light filtering through the small basement windows barely illuminated the room. She moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Then she heard it, a faint sound, like someone sobbing. "Ethan," she called out, her voice trembling. The sobbing stopped, replaced by a tense silence. Mrs. White's heart pounded in her chest as she moved deeper into the basement. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she spotted a figure huddled in the corner. It was Ethan. He was curled up against the wall, his knees drawn to his chest, his face buried in his arms. His body shook with silent sobs, and Mrs. White's heart shattered at the sight of him. "Ethan," she whispered, rushing to his side. She knelt down beside him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "It's okay. I'm here." For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. Then, slowly, he lifted his head, his tear-streaked face filled with despair. His eyes, usually so guarded, were now wide with terror. "I can't do it anymore," he whispered, his voice broken. "I can't keep pretending everything's okay. It's not okay." Mrs. White's throat tightened with emotion. "I know, Ethan. I know it's not okay, but you don't have to do this alone. We're going to help you." Ethan shook his head, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "It's too late. They're going to hurt me. They're going to hurt all of us." Mrs. White's pulse quickened. "Who, Ethan? Who's going to hurt you?" Ethan's eyes darted around the room, as if he were afraid someone was watching. "The people who come here. My dad. He's in too deep. He can't stop them." Mrs. White's stomach turned. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made the danger feel even more real. "We're going to stop them," she said firmly. "We're going to make sure they can't hurt you anymore. But I need you to trust me, Ethan. Can you do that?" Ethan's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, he seemed to consider her words. Then, with a shaky breath, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "I trust you." Mrs. White had barely slept since her conversation with Ethan in the basement. His words replayed in her mind, each one a haunting reminder of the danger lurking in his home. She knew that time was running out, and if she didn't act soon, the consequences could be catastrophic. But the reality of her situation weighed heavily on her. She no longer had the authority of her position as principal, and the school board had made it clear that they wouldn't back her if things escalated. But none of that mattered. Ethan's life was on the line, and Mrs. White was determined to protect him, no matter what it cost her. The next morning, she sat in her office for what felt like the last time. Her desk, usually cluttered with school paperwork, felt strangely empty. The end of the week was approaching, and with it, her resignation. She glanced at the clock. It was almost time to meet Mr. Harper. Together, they would confront Mr. Barnes once more, but this time, they would not be leaving without ensuring Ethan's safety. As Mrs. White gathered her things, the door to her office opened, and Mr. Harper entered, his face grim but determined. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. Mrs. White nodded, though her stomach churned with a mix of fear and anticipation. "We don't have a choice. We can't let this continue." Mr. Harper sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I spoke with Ethan earlier. He's terrified, but he's ready to leave the house if we can get him out." Mrs. White's heart ached for the boy, but she forced herself to remain focused. "Then let's do it. We need to get Ethan out of there before his father realizes what's happening." The drive to Ethan's house was tense. Both Mrs. White and Mr. Harper lost in their thoughts as the weight of what they were about to do settled over them. They were taking a huge risk, not only for Ethan, but for themselves. If this went wrong, they could face legal consequences, and Ethan's father could retaliate. When they arrived, the house looked as ominous as ever, the curtains still drawn and the air thick with tension. Mrs. White's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the front door, her hand shaking slightly as she knocked. After a few moments, the door opened, and Mr. Barnes stood before them, his expression cold and unreadable. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice sharp. "We're here to take Ethan," Mrs. White said, her voice firm despite the fear swirling in her gut. "He's not safe here, and we won't leave without him." Mr. Barnes's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Mrs. White could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. But instead of lashing out, he smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a chill down her spine. "You think you can just take my son?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "You have no right." "We have every right," Mr. Harper said, stepping forward. "Ethan has been living in fear, and it's clear that whatever is happening here is dangerous. We're not leaving without him." Mr. Barnes's smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You've crossed the line. You think you can come into my house and tell me how to raise my sons?" Mrs. White's hands clenched into fists, her fear giving way to anger. "This isn't about how you raise your son. This is about his safety. Ethan told us everything, about the people coming to your house, about the threats, about the danger. We know what's going on, and we won't let you keep him here." For a moment, the tension in the air was unbearable. Mr. Barnes stood frozen, his eyes locked on Mrs. White, his face a mask of fury. Then, without warning, he lunged toward her, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. But Mr. Harper was faster. He stepped between them, shoving Mr. Barnes back with a forceful push. "Don't touch her," he growled, his voice cold and firm. Mr. Barnes stumbled back, his face contorted with rage. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he spat. "You think you're saving him, but you're just making it worse. They'll come for him. They'll come for all of you." Mrs. White's blood ran cold at his words, but she refused to back down. "Who's coming for him? Tell us." Mr. Barnes's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Mrs. White thought he might lash out again. But instead, he straightened, his face hardening into a mask of indifference. "You'll find out soon enough," he said quietly. "But by then, it'll be too late." Before either Mrs. White or Mr. Harper could respond, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Dad, stop!" Mr. Barnes turned to face his son, his expression softening for a brief moment. "Ethan, go back inside. This doesn't concern you." But Ethan shook his head, his voice trembling as he spoke. "No, I'm going with them. I'm not staying here." For a moment, Mr. Barnes looked stunned. Then his face twisted in anger, and he took a step toward Ethan, his hand raised as if to strike him. "You ungrateful!" Mrs. White moved forward, standing protectively in front of Ethan. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You will not hurt him." Mr. Barnes froze, his hands still in the air, but his eyes were filled with rage. Slowly, he lowered his arm, his chest heaving with barely contained fury. "Fine," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Take him, but you'll regret it. All of you." Mrs. White didn't waste any more time. She turned to Ethan, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let's go," she said softly. Ethan nodded, his entire body trembling as he followed Mrs. White and Mr. Harper out of the house. They moved quickly, not daring to look back as they made their way to the car. As they drove away, the tension in the car was thick, but there was also a sense of relief that they had gotten Ethan out. But Mrs. White couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in her chest. Mr. Barnes's final words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that this wasn't over. They had taken Ethan away from the immediate danger, but whatever forces were lurking in the shadows were still out there. And now, they knew that Mrs. White, Mr. Harper, and Ethan were defying them. As they pulled into the school parking lot, Mrs. White turned to Ethan, who sat silently in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You're safe now," she said softly. "We're going to take care of you." Ethan nodded, but there was a distant look in his eyes, as if he wasn't fully convinced. Mrs. White understood. He had been living in fear for so long that it would take time for him to believe that the danger had passed. But even as she reassured him, a gnawing feeling settled in her stomach. She knew that this wasn't the end. There was something bigger at play, something darker than she had imagined. And now, they were all part of it. In the days following their confrontation with Mr. Barnes, Mrs. White and Mr. Harper worked tirelessly to ensure Ethan's safety. They had contacted social services, and Ethan had been placed in a safe, temporary home while the authorities began their investigation into his father. The process was slow, but it was moving in the right direction. However, despite the immediate danger being removed, the sense of unease remained. Mr. Barnes's final words haunted Mrs. White and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more than what Ethan had revealed, more than what the authorities would uncover. The school board had accepted her resignation, and her final day as principal of Oakwood Academy was approaching. It was a bittersweet end to a career she had dedicated her life to, but Mrs. White knew she had made the right choice. Protecting Ethan had been worth every sacrifice, even if it meant leaving the school behind. On her last day, as she packed up her office, Mr. Harper stopped by to say goodbye. He leaned against the doorframe, his usual calm demeanor tinged with sadness. "You did the right thing, you know," he said quietly. "Ethan's safe, because of you." Mrs. White smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know, but it still feels like there's more we don't know. I can't help but wonder what we've missed." Mr. Harper nodded, his expression thoughtful. "There's definitely something bigger going on, but for now, we've done what we can. The rest is up to the authorities." Mrs. White sighed, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her. "I just hope Ethan can finally find some peace." As they spoke, there was a soft knock on the door. Mrs. White looked up to see Ethan standing in the hallway, his hands nervously clutching the straps of his backpack. "Hi, Ethan," she said warmly. "How are you doing?" Ethan shrugged, his eyes downcast. "I'm okay, I guess." Mrs. White stood up, crossing the room to stand in front of him. "I know this has been really hard for you, but I want you to know that you're safe now. No matter what happens, you're not alone." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained solemn. "Thanks, Mrs. White. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped me." Mrs. White placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're a strong young man, Ethan. You'll get through this." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. Then, with a small smile, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. White and Mr. Harper alone in the office. As the door closed behind him, Mrs. White felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that Ethan was safe, sadness that her time at Oakwood was coming to an end, and a lingering sense of unease about what the future might hold. But one thing was certain: no matter what came next, she had made the right choice. She had stood up for what was right, even when it meant risking everything. And for that, she had no regrets. Hey there! Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. It really helps us out and lets us know you want to see more. We'd love to hear from you. What part of the story impacted you the most? Was it the suspense, the twists, or maybe the characters? Let us know in the comments below. And if you have any story ideas or suggestions you'd like to see on the channel, feel free to share those as well. We're always excited to hear what kinds of stories you're interested in. Thanks again for watching, and we can't wait to bring you more.